Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CPR. As many of you know, this seminar is part of our monthly urban workshop that the Center for Policy Research and the French Institute of Social Sciences, CSH, organized together. The honors that I do today are normally done by my colleagues from the CSH, but they're traveling today, so I'm going to introduce Olga and the subject. So, Olga is going to speak today on sustainable cities through heritage revival. She's going to present case studies from across Asia. Just to introduce her, Olga is an international sustainable urban development consultant. She is the founder of Unicity and a program manager at Seher Intac. Um, she has an impressive consulting profile, as you've all read on the email. I was particularly struck by 5 major international programs, 20 cities, 40 countries. That's a lot of experience to bring to the table right now, today for us, and we're very privileged to have you here. I believe that today's presentation is going to focus on examples from across Asia and specifically looking at sustainability and heritage as an intersection, which is something that all of us, many of us are concerned about, but not necessarily know a lot about. So it's a privilege to have you here, Olga, today. And we're going to have a 45-minute sort of slot of her speaking, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions and answers.
Uh, Hello, everyone. Many thanks, Mukta, for the introduction, and many thanks also for giving me this opportunity to be here. So, in fact, I have presented at a number of international fora, but that level of academic kind of talk is my first one. So, it's both a pleasure, and I am very much looking forward to the discussion we are going to have, as this usually happens in this specific talk format. Just to specify, the work that we are doing is very focused on practice. In fact, myself, I'm not a researcher, but more a practitioner. As Mukta has mentioned, I worked with a number of cities, looking at practically how, in particular, climate resilience can be improved. And then over the last couple of years, I entered into the heritage field, and now looking more and more on how we can enhance not only on natural assets, but also on cultural assets in Asian cities. What we're going to share here is also work in progress. And I take this occasion to introduce my team, Seher and Tag team, so Anushka Gupta and Anusha Kant, who have been very instrumental in preparing this presentation as well. I'll start with mentioning something from my just recent experience. I was at the World Urban Forum last month, and that was gathering about 25,000 people from all over the world discussing the urban issues. And one of the plenary sessions, big sessions, was called Cities of Jane Jacobs. So that session was featuring two prominent experts. One of them was from India, PK Das from Bombay, and one was Joan Clos, who was the ex-executive secretary of UN Habitat and also ex-mayor of Barcelona. So for about an hour, they were having this talk on what these cities mean today, and somehow focusing a lot on Western cities. So when the question and answer session came, the question I asked them was, how come that the learnings that we got from the 60s and the Jane Jacobs approach to Western cities that now is mainstream to a good extent, not everywhere in the West, how come that Asian cities have not benefited so much from this? And we're still seeing exactly the urban sprawl that was happening in the West 60 years back. And so, in fact, they couldn't give much substance in the answer. But the interesting thing was that after that event, so many people came to see me and just to say, yes, you're so right, and this is so important. So what I drew from it is not that I am so great, but that actually there is so much concern now about Asian cities developing in this kind of concrete jungle way. And I realize more and more that I work on this topic is that people actually want something else. And so this something else, to a large extent, we can get inspired from the heritage assets and learning experiences. So this is the reason why today I want to share with you a few of these glimpses. Just to open up this talk, let's look at the status of built heritage in India. So in India, we have about 7,500 protected buildings. Half of them are protected by the ASI, this is the Archaeological Survey of India, and about half of them at the state level. And in addition to this, a few cities such as Delhi, Ahmedabad, Mumbai, Hyderabad also have some notified buildings. So that's as much. Now, compared to the whole heritage building stock in India, this is less than 1%. So this means that 99.3% of heritage buildings in India can be demolished anytime. There is absolutely no legal mechanism that will stop from doing this unless people file a case in the court for a specific building. So this is how INTAC since 84 has been addressing these issues, and in fact I joined INTAC for this program because I believe INTAC is doing tremendous work in precisely looking into all the unprotected heritage in India, which as I just mentioned is largely the major part of it. Now, how did SEHER and TAG, Sustainable Cities Through Heritage Revival, come into the picture? So we were in discussions with INTAC. At that time, I was pretty much focused on climate resilience in cities. And Divya Gupta told me that, who is heading the Architectural Heritage Division, he told me that, in fact, now maybe as INTAC, we also need to look into the challenges cities face today. In India and see how heritage can contribute to them. So that's precisely what we decided to focus on with SEHER and TAC, with kind of three major focuses. One of them is building an advocacy argument. So the results that I'm going to present today, partial results because this is work in progress, this is precisely to look into what kind of specific knowledge pieces, experiences we can share with the Indian government at all levels, both national, state, and local, which could contribute to them looking at heritage in a different way and seeing it as an active contributor to urban development, rather than seeing it separately from the urban fabric altogether. So this advocacy argument precisely focuses on collecting such evidence that yes, heritage generates economic, social, and environmental benefits, and some of them I'm going to share with you right now. The second axis of action is looking into specific cities and developing action plans for them so that we can have demonstration cases. And the third component is outreach and dissemination. So in fact, over the last few months, we started interacting internationally, starting with the World Urban Forum, and we're discussing a few international partnerships, building community of practices, both in India and at the Asian level, just to gather urban practitioners who want to see cities which have human scale, which have uniqueness, and which have environmental sustainability. So we'll start with this case of Siem Reap, Cambodia. And why is this case so interesting? So, of course, you've heard of Angkor Park. This is the largest, of course, heritage site of Cambodia, which gathers about 2.2 million foreign tourists a year and about the same amount of national visitors. So national visitors are not accounted for as such because there are no tickets. The entrance is free for them. And this park contributes to over 2% of GDP of the country, about $95 million. So a major site. A few points that make it very interesting in terms of how this site is managed. So when we look at the site, it's actually a living area. About 130,000 people live in Angkor Park. So this park is kind of overlapping with the city of Siem Reap, which is the second city of Cambodia. It's basically located, I don't have the map here exactly, but Angkor Park is located on the north of the city and is managed by an institution called Apsara, National Authority, in which northern part of the city is both managed by Apsara and by the Siem Reap municipality. So it's kind of cross-cutting territory. And the city of Siem Reap has about 2,100 people, whereas that Angkor Park has 130, and unofficially Apsara believes the same number, 200,000 people approximately. So very interesting because it's a major historical site, of course, World Heritage Site as well, bringing a large amount of economic output. to the country. And yet the site has not been isolated from its population, but on the contrary, is very much used. So when you visit Angkor Park, you can actually, as a Khmer person, as a Cambodian national, you can very easily drive into or walk into it and use it as you wish. I mean, of course, there is respect to both natural and built heritage, but apart from that, there are large numbers of green areas where people have picnics, they play different kinds of sports. So for local people, it's really it is possible to live there. It is possible to have recreation activities. It is a very kind of vibrant site for them, in addition for tourists to be there. So of course there is then an interaction between the locals and the tourists. So as you can see on the picture, there are a number of crafts that happen that target the tourist community. And in addition, a number of small restaurant outlets, again, that people are using. In addition to this, there are also commercial activities. The picture that you see on the very, it's a little maybe not very visible, it's basically an Indian wedding that happens in these temples. So the site officially closes at 6 p.m., but then you can actually rent out certain areas, and I'm sure there is a kind of a protocol of how you behave in there, but it is also possible to conduct private activities. So the site is not only living out of the usual kind of ticketing activities, but a number of other activities that also generate economic opportunities. Even more interesting than that, the site, the park, actually has a number of what you call barrays or water reservoirs. So these water reservoirs, which you see in blue on the map, these ones are very ancient. They used to supply water to the whole city, and at its peak time, the city reached about 1 million people. So now it is 5 times less. Or actually, if you consider Angkor Park, okay, it's maybe a little less than half. So these barrays, with time, have dried out. But Apsara Authority has a number of very active people who are also passionate about environment, in addition to looking into the built heritage structures. So gradually they started reviving these barrays. So initially they revived the northern barray, and then the one on the east top that you see. And then they focused on the West Barray, which is actually quite big in volume. It's about 56 million square meters, which was revived only about slightly over a year back. So they completely filled it with water, and you can see pictures of how it looks like. And that played a number of key roles for the city. So first, it started replenishing the groundwater, because as many cities in developing Asian countries, Siem Reap faces a strong issue with water supply. So at that time, that was about a year back, only about 20% of people were connected to pipes, and 80% were pumping water from the ground. So by reviving the barray, to some extent, that issue could be mitigated. In addition, water started to be used for irrigation. Now the plan of Apsara Authority was to actually also revive the East Barray, and then starting to supply water to the city itself. Because if the system could supply for 1 million people in the past, then 20,000 people, 200,000 people could be covered. That was the rationale. Looking into the geographic position of Angkor Park. So Angkor Park is located between Kulen Mountains at the north, so downstream of Kulen Mountains, and upstream of Tonle Sap Lake, which is the biggest lake of Cambodia. So that is very interesting, because again, if these barrays are functional, in times of monsoon, they can mitigate floods. And in fact, since revival of these barrays started, although the western one was fully replenished recently, but its cleaning started a few years earlier. So what Apsara told me, since 2011, they actually didn't have any major floods. That's because the water from Kulen Mountains would stop and replenish the barrays. I would also note that in case of Kulen Mountains, Cambodia, I think, is second or third country that faces hardest deforestation in the world. So the Kulen Mountains were very much touched by it. And as a result, of course, the city became much more vulnerable to floods. So reviving these barrays became something very, very important. What I'm trying to focus on here is that we have a heritage water supply system that actually can play an incredible role today. But so now, that is what can happen technically, and some parts of it I have already shared with you. But now the city administration, the administration of Siem Reap, decided to deal with water supply and then address the national authorities, and JICA, the Japanese bilateral assistance institution, came into the picture and did an assessment of what kind of system could provide water supply to the city. So several solutions were looked at. Eventually, the solution which was selected was to pump water from the downstream Tonle Sap Lake, which is about 40 kilometers downstream, which is also depleting because, first of all, it's just drying out, and second, because there are several barrages on the Mekong River, it just doesn't get water anymore. And third, the water quality of Tonle Sap Lake is actually pretty poor. So quite a significant amount of funding would be required to actually treat this raw water so that it can become potable water. Nevertheless, they have selected this option, which too was not a grant, but the city would take a loan from JICA and pay for this kind of solution. Whereas Apsara Authority was saying that we actually, if we revive the Eastern Baray, which is you can see on the right side, that is only 5 kilometers upstream, so water naturally will flow, and we can ensure you that supply will take place. That unfortunately was not selected, and at that time I was working for UNDP on Siem Reap, on climate resilience, not specifically on heritage issues. But once I understood that point, we went to Phnom Penh, and then we met JICA. We listened to their side of the story. And so what JICA told us is that we are not confident because Apsara Authority is a different authority from the city authority, and therefore, if suddenly they decide to change their point of view and they close down the barrays for us, then the city will remain without water supply. So interesting is that the system is there and it can play a role, but now the institutional barriers just stop heritage from actually providing benefits to the city. And to my knowledge, as of now, the situation stays where it is. It has not been solved or advanced in any kind of manner. So unfortunately, it's still a dormant potential. But it is very interesting to understand that there are a number of situations like this. So even in India, we, at a certain point in time at Seher Intact, we briefly looked, we'll come back to that point, into ancient water systems in India. And there again, we saw that there are a number of baulis, a number of different kind of water provision sources that were available in ancient times, which most often just are depleted, are not used in any way. So it would be very interesting, in fact, to focus on these and see what role they can play today, because in addition to actually being in a position to providing concrete benefits, they also provide a kind of aesthetic and connecting aspect to the city. In fact, in that respect, when we look into climate resilience, now the new trend with planners, by large in Europe, but also startingly in Asia, looks into how, instead of making the water move fast when it rains heavily, when precipitations are high, instead how do you retain water on the sites? And for that matter, for example, China now is quite famous with the sponge cities, where it looks into porous pavement so that the pavement can absorb water. Along with that, replenishing groundwater, of course, will take place. Along with that, also doing rainwater harvesting and reviving these ancient systems that are there could perfectly be combined with the objective of climate resilience. But that, again, pretty much a dormant potential. Another case, now I'm moving to actually a very developed city-state. So Singapore used to be a country, and separately they had city authorities, and then slightly over a year back they just merged. So now it's both a state and a city, and it's managed by one kind of single level of governance. So with the case of Singapore, we look, in fact, there's a lot to learn from the case of Singapore. But I guess in this specific case, what I'll focus on is to say that is it enough not to demolish, or do we need to do more to actually make heritage play its full role in the city than just stop from demolition? So just to give you an initial overview, Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world now, but that was absolutely not the case as, as such a short time as like 50, 60 years back. So at independence at 1965, the annual GDP per capita was actually $320 only. Versus now, so we got the statistics of about 10 years back, that was already 60,000, so a tremendous leap economically. At the same time, tourism industry is quite dynamic. We'll talk about it a little bit later. And just to give you this overview of the leap that Singapore made economically, now let us look into details of what has contributed to that. So initially, coming to, of course, just to nuance the case a little bit, Singapore, of course, is a very special case because it's a small country city. It's also quite centrally governed, and also at independence, it did receive quite a significant international assistance, financial assistance. But nevertheless, certain principles and institutional setups, policies that were developed definitely can be quite instrumental in a number of other cities and countries. So initially, after the independence from the 60s to about 70s, early 80s, the motto was demolish to build. So heritage structures were not that much of interest, and in fact, people just wanted to remove a large number of them so that they can build new house stock, so that they can look more modern and they can provide for housing in a bigger manner by building a high rise and so on. So demolitions were taking place quite extensively over this period of time. Now in 83, the government looked into the tourism statistics and it realized that since 1965, actually tourism was steadily going down. About 3.5% of tourists they were losing year on year. So they connected it to their policy of demolishing heritage and they decided to completely shift things around. So the way they did this, they moved from demolish to build to what they called old and new, bring things together. That resulted in what you see on the map in spotting key conservation areas, which will have different status. There would be 4 historic districts, and we'll talk about them just right now. And there would be residential heritage pockets in different areas of the city. An important point that immediately was taken into consideration is that one single building will not play such a role as if it's a historic area. So immediately from that time, when they did decide to build uniqueness through their built assets, they decided to focus on preserving areas. And that too, what they call the 3R principle, was combined retention, restoration, and repair. So that program, the conservation program that they began at that time, was the first large-scale urban conservation program that would protect areas versus specific buildings. Looking now into just a quick kind of timeline of what kind of policies were put in place. So the Monuments Act was enacted in 1971. That was preserving specific monuments, but then immediately, and so very interestingly, immediately heritage became part of the overall legislation of urban development. So the concept plan, for example, that up until now is developed every 10 years, so the last one was developed in 2011, the concept plan immediately introduced the notion of identity. And so there, Singaporeans have understood at that time, analyzing tourism statistics, that people come to see something unique. So if you do remove everything that has a flavor of the place, then why would people visit this specific place versus other places? So very clearly the focus was put on identity, and identity in fact became the first even of the 7 key proposals in the concept plan 2001, but then we haven't looked into all the subsequent plans, but in addition to mainstreaming it into the concept plan, which is a kind of generic plan from which the master plan will derive for every 5 years, there is a special identity plan as well that will really look into what is the identity of Singapore and how different tangible and intangible assets contribute to building it. So in the 70s, this kind of legislation took place, and then in 98, the Urban Redevelopment Authority was created. So this authority, in fact, is a very interesting entity. So this is a scheme of 4 major kind of institutions that play a role in relation to heritage altogether. So the Urban Redevelopment Authority is not a heritage authority altogether. So this is the authority that is responsible for strategic planning of the whole city. And heritage is one of its aspects, and it is completely indivisible. So what happens in many countries is that there is a special entity that cares for heritage, and then there is an entity that cares for urban development, and these two very often don't even interact. So here, very intelligently, from the very beginning, this authority was given the mandate to protect heritage areas. So from that time, from mid-80s, there was no demolition of heritage that would take place at all. Whatever was there needed to be revived. And we'll talk about how that was done on examples of specific areas. But the institutional setup, I think, is very important because in Singapore, these institutions don't work in silos. So first of all, the URA altogether already combines the different functions. And then in addition, it closely interacts with the Singapore Tourism Board, which is responsible for boosting tourism, and with the Preservation of Monuments Board, which then is responsible for protecting every specific monument, and the National Heritage Board as well, that focuses on intangible heritage. So all of these, they belong to different ministries, but yet very closely work together. Coming to specific areas now. So out of the 4 major historic districts, so these 3 I have selected to talk about: Little India, Chinatown, and Kampong Glam. These areas are located relatively not far from each other in the center and were preserved as areas. So there a number of provisions took place. So I already talked about district conservation approach. In addition to this, adaptive reuse. So many of these houses, they were kind of mixed-use outlets where the business would be on the ground floor and then the owners would live on the upper floor. So gradually people moved out of these houses from living purposes, but these shops now play a role of restaurants, shops, and so on. The envelope, the heritage envelope of the building was completely preserved, and adaptive reuse took place. So now different usages from the initial time happen, but then the area is still there. So certain usages were judged incompatible with the historic kind of character. So for example, you have many food outlets, but you're not allowed to have a Western fast food outlet or to have a supermarket. So in fact, these areas do have, to a large extent, the flavor of the countries they refer to. So Kampong Glam is more kind of a Muslim Malaysian, Chinatown is like Chinese immigrants, and Little India mostly South Indian immigrants. So you have food consequently in relation to these cultures. A number of intangible heritage activities take place, different festivals. In fact, the owners of the shops also associate, and they create intangible heritage activities together because they believe that boosts tourism. So there is also cooperation taking place. The government has very much incentivized these kind of usages. They provide awards for successful renovations of different shops by shop owners. So it is very much supported, but regulations at the same time are very strict. You absolutely cannot demolish anything from what is there. So this is to show you that Singapore really cares about the aesthetic value of the city beyond heritage areas. So you can see this, blue building together with the green building. So that is something that you just walk into. This is not part of any major historic district. But as much as I visited Singapore, I've never seen one heritage building stand alone. There would be always a few buildings, and the surrounding urban fabric would be built in such a way that it aesthetically doesn't significantly interfere with the actual heritage building. So as you can see at the background of the heritage buildings, you have a few buildings, but because they are together and you have open access to them, then they do have a kind of a holistic view. So I walked into these houses and asked how they are used. So the government has given them to different cultural associations. So the blue building is a theater which moved there about two years back. On a preferential kind of rate that the government has provided to the theater company. And the small yellow house on the left, this is a Singapore Calligraphy Society, which has been there for much longer, for about 2 decades. They said they've been there. So the government also sees to the life of these buildings, that they don't stay empty, but they continue playing a role where people also go and experience them. I've also added this panorama just to show that there is continuity. In fact, so this is a very interesting road because you see cars, but then you have a very nice pedestrian path which just brings you from one side to another. So it becomes very easy to kind of switch between heritage area, modern areas, and wherever you are, there is really kind of an attention paid to how you will experience the city, how you will see. I'll show you more examples. So coming to Kampong Glam, a few interesting points to mention. So first of all, mostly it's pedestrianized. So these are relatively narrow streets with shops and restaurants. So you're not disturbed in your experience of kind of looking into heritage by cars. You can just walk here and there, and it is combined with contemporary art. As you see, it's not just kind of freezed in time, but shop owners are allowed to bring in different kind of interpretations, provided that facades are not, of course, touched and damaged. This is also an area which is very nicely inserted into the urban fabric. So this, what I have shown from inside, actually just before you enter into this area, so you see this kind of buildings on the road with a pedestrian path just behind the car line, and just in front of it, this park that you see underneath, where also, I mean, it's a completely modern modern facility, nothing to do with heritage. But why I decided to show you this, it's because it's not that you exit from a heritage area and suddenly you're in the middle of a nowhere and it's ugly and it's aggressive, but there is a continuity of a pleasant experience of the city in which heritage gains as well. It's basically, this approach is bringing extra value to both areas, because once you experience a park, you sit nicely, and then you cross and you experience heritage, nowhere you're hustled. So this continuity very much brings out the potential of heritage. If you have a heritage area that maybe is nice in itself, but as soon as you step out, then you kind of need to recover from that experience, that becomes a different point. So this is Little India. So in Little India, curiously, I think that was the less organized of the three areas. And there also, one of the issues probably is that cars were much more predominant than in the other two areas. And in fact, as you can see on the top left corner picture, you have a number of cars that also park on the roadsides. So now this is something that you very rarely see in Singapore. Most of the times parking would be elsewhere, which also allows this kind of flowing experience that the pedestrian doesn't have barriers as he walks. And usually roads are very nicely isolated by greenery and trees. So the fact that cars would park in front of the shops would kind of provide you less positive experience that you would have in other areas in this sense. So I felt that a little more pedestrianization here really would help. And now coming to Chinatown. So Chinatown was very interesting. Here you see the metro station that reaches right in the middle of the historical area. So here another important point, access to heritage is very important. It's not that you struggle and go somewhere to see a heritage part of the city. It is completely integrated. So maybe you just visited the Marina Bay, which is the new kind of development on the reclaimed area from the sea. And then a few stations away, you reach Chinatown, and then now you have a completely different experience altogether in here. So a few glimpses of Chinatown. One street is now under restoration and redevelopment. Most of the streets are pedestrian. I wanted to show you the picture on the right top corner. So despite the fact it's Chinatown, there is also a big Hindu temple in there in the South Indian style. So while these areas kind of keep, to an extent, a flavor of the immigrants of the place where it's kind of it's attached to. At the same time, there is no it's not a silo. There is still quite a good level of mix between the different cultures. Even the same I saw in Kampong Glam. There are certain Indian shops, and in Little India you will have some kind of Arabic clothes also to be sold. So that is a nice kind of atmosphere that shows that cultures coexist together in a relatively comfortable setup. And finally, this food court again in Chinatown. So initially, there used to be a lot of street food in this area in Singapore. And then the government actually decided to combine these food outlets and provide them a designated venue. So what I found interesting in this venue is that the new kind of cover that they have built upon the street. First of all, it aesthetically is not damaging the heritage perception. It plays quite a good practical role, because then now you can sit in this area during the day also when it's hot, and there, as you can see, there are fans and ways of cooling down the temperature a bit, so it can be used more. And then of course hygiene is quite well taken care of. So I'm not sure in this area, but in other similar heritage areas, for example Clarke Quay, there are public facilities, public washrooms. So each restaurant doesn't have their own washroom, but then those public ones they have, first of all, they are maybe like maximum 1 minute walk from whichever restaurant you would be in, and second, perfectly maintained, so there is no inhibition in using them. So, right, okay. Yes, so coming to Clarke Quay now, another important aspect of heritage, artistic lighting. So basically with Singapore, what you see is that it's not just restoring heritage in itself. It's everything working to enhance the character of heritage, and heritage also benefiting other parts of the city. So here, for example, Clarke Quay, you can see the old shop houses, and then that coupled with the contemporary setup, which also has an interesting lighting, so that creates, again, an attraction for people to look at. Another important point. So again, heritage was not the only focus of Singapore, but equally as much as they focused on reviving cultural assets, they focused on reviving natural assets. So about 50% of the Singapore's territory is covered in greenery, and about 10% of the land is dedicatedly set aside for parks and natural conservation areas, which means that land use regulations are very strict. You cannot just go and build anything anywhere you want, and that too, wherever you are allowed to build, you have to provide for trees and greenery along the roads. So this is the map of different park, what they call Park Connect network. So most of them are already in place, but new parks are getting developed. And the intention is really that you can walk in green areas throughout the city. How did it benefit climate change? So mitigation rather. So in fact, temperature has risen by about 1 degree over the last 40 years. The rainfall has also increased by about 600 millimeters in the last 34 years, and the sea level has risen by half a meter. But yet, what you see, despite the fact that developed areas are increasing, actually the flood-prone areas are decreasing. So that is, again, it's not directly related to heritage, but it is very important that by enforcing certain land use regulations and focusing on preserving natural ecosystems, you can actually mitigate climate change to a large extent. So I'll skip this because Mukta is reminding me of time. So this is how it looks like. In fact, the city looks pretty much like a garden altogether. And I guess what I want to emphasize upon is that honestly, Singapore doesn't have such heritage structures that one would travel for them. It's not Angkor Wat, it's simple house shops. So by only reviving these assets, it would not bring that much tourism and interest. Also, if you look, if only they had focused on green areas, yes, certainly these are nice kind of tropical greeneries, but again, would it make that much impact? So Singapore really, the way it became one of the major tourist attractions in the world and one of the most livable cities in the world as well, is because they approached the city holistically. Like every element was important and every element would come together. This is why also the Urban Redevelopment Authority really works on all of these things holistically rather than different institutions dealing with these points separately. So just quickly to show again how well it benefited to the city by doing this kind of measures. The travel and tourism in GDP is constantly increasing, and they expect about 10% of GDP come from the sector by 2025. And similarly, nearly 10% of total employment also comes from the sector. I guess the learnings I have already shared just now, that this holistic approach is extremely important, and all elements enhance each other. The strictness of planning and enforcement of the planning has also brought its fruit, and now let us after this kind of city holistic case, I thought I'll come to something now very concrete and very specific. Because true, in the Indian context, we will say, okay, this is huge, this is big, and yes, the institutional setup is completely different, and how is it possible, and how can we apply? Actually, sometimes one step can change a lot of things, and it doesn't even require that much of initial investment. So let us move to the neighboring Vietnam, the city of Hanoi, the capital, and look at that kind of step that they have taken. Just to quickly introduce Hanoi, in fact, urban areas play an increasingly big role in Vietnam, and they contribute about 70% of the GDP and less than 30% of the population. I mean, the situation is similar in many Asian countries. Now, what is interesting about Hanoi is that the constructed land in meters, square meters per person is actually quite high, 145 square meters, versus green spaces. These are quite reduced. There's only 1 square meter per person. So imagine the proportion. The city has 4 distinct historic areas, and I want to focus on one of them, which is Hoan Kiem Lake. So this lake is located in the very heart of the city, surrounded by the old quarter, what they call, which mostly now has the French colonial structures, a few from before, but very few, a few temples. This old quarter is characterized by plot development, very narrow kind of plots, which gives a very interesting architectural mix, because then every owner will kind of bring its own touch to it. So now what has been done is that about less than a year back, yes, slightly over a year back, that started in early 2017, the government has decided to pedestrianize the area around the lake. So I just jump from one slide to another. So you can look at the left-hand side. All the roads in orange have become pedestrian from Friday night to Saturday midnight, basically. So over the weekend, you can say. And you can see the difference between, in fact, in Vietnam, overwhelmingly they have motorbikes over cars, so you can see all these motorbikes running, and then suddenly the whole area becomes pedestrian, and people are using it. So, parking spots were provided so that people can still reach the area, but then they need to just go by themselves. So this measure didn't cost anything. It's just enforcing. In fact, there were a number of consultations that were conducted. A few points were spotted on how they reached this measure. So there were regulations of the ancient quota. There was a detailed plan of the lake that was developed. There was public opposition in a neighboring area about 2-3 kilometers away. to commercial development, so that the public had overruled and the park stayed intact. So the authorities could see that people actually do connect with the area and want to spend time outside to a good extent. A series of international workshops took place. UN Habitat was quite instrumental in promoting certain measures. So eventually, on the suggestion of UN Habitat, they made this try of 3 months. And this try has actually resulted in making the measure permanent. As of now, it is still functioning, and now the mayor is so confident about it that actually he's claiming it is his measure, and kind of adding to his political portfolio with it, which is exactly what we want. Because once the politicians have appropriated the measure, it means that it has a chance to stay, and it means that there is a clear public demand for this. So just showing the outcomes of it, it's a very lively area. I've seen it at the time that the measure was implemented. So about 50 to 70,000 people visited every weekend and really enjoy. And what is important, both locals and tourists. It's not an area dedicated to tourists, but local people spend as much time there as the tourists. And just to finish the cases, so surprisingly, I'm going to talk about Italy. And why we decided to share this case with you is because Italy actually allows us to see where Asia could stand in the future, in the future decades. And why is this? Is because today Italy is the most quoted example, you can say, of tremendous heritage experience. So it has the biggest number of World Heritage sites, 51. Large number of protected monuments, large number of international visitors. But then it was not always the case. In fact, if you look at the end of the Second World War, two things had happened. So first of all, Italy was quite rural by that time. And with the assistance of the Western world, Marshall Plan and so on for reconstruction, Italy started industrializing very fast. So in this process, its urbanization has also become quite fast, and new constructions took place. So now you see the state of certain heritage buildings at the end of the World War, of course, heavily damaged by bombarding. So fast demolition started taking place. In addition to this, public opinion was not aspiring so much to preserve heritage. In fact, there was this kind of cultural US-based influence of modern and new is good. People started massively moving out of historic cores and settling in new neighboring areas. So you can say that heritage was quite under the threat. And why this example is relevant is because it's exactly what is happening in Asia now. There is fast urbanization. A large number of people don't want heritage buildings. They are considered old and unfashionable for them to live in. So there is this whole movement of, just building new. However, a few things stopped demolition in Italy and allowed it to stand as it stands now in terms of its international visibility. So two key elements. One was the mobilization of informed civil society. A few organizations formed around the 50s and the 60s by, for example, Italia Nostra was a movement combining different artists, architects, intellectuals, who started spreading out awareness about the value of heritage and also informing, doing different kinds of activities, interacting with the government, voicing out what could be lost for the country. The same was happening with the National Association for Historical and Artistic Centers, who more focused on research, building knowledge products, so building awareness at, you can say, like more technical level, and the National Institute of Planning, which appeared actually even in the 30s, but took a very active role at that critical time for Italy, also promoting conservation and development of historical towns. So as a result of this movement, an interesting thing happened at the legislation level in Italy. So, yes, certainly heritage was part of the constitution that was formed in 48, but that in India also, there are articles in the constitution that talk about heritage protection. That doesn't help by itself. Now, in 64, the Franceschini Commission was formed. So this commission basically resulted out of the public inquiry of all these civil society movements, saying that now we really need to assess how we want our cities to look in the future. So this commission was composed by 16 parliamentarians and about 11 experts from different fields, urban planners, architects, historians, etc. And its objective was to review the existing legislation and institutional framework, as well as funding mechanisms, and see how heritage protection could take place. As a result of the work of this commission, and I just put also the international level, that was the time of the Venice Charter of ICOM coming up, ICOMOS coming up. The decision was that at this point in time, every city has to develop a city development plan, looking both into heritage zone and non-heritage zone. So in Italy, very clearly from that point in time, the city had to preserve its historic area as a whole. Again, not same as in the case of Singapore, except that there was much more heritage in the case of Italy at that time. The whole historic core had to be preserved. And every city had the responsibility to develop a plan, not only looking into how the heritage area will be developing, but also how the non-heritage areas will be developing and what is the vision of the city overall. So very important, again, not only focus on heritage areas, but focusing on the city as a whole. So I won't develop further on this by lack of time, but an important conclusion that now we can look forward from that measure. We are 50 years ahead of it. And what we see is that Italy, in fact, is facing a number of challenges in terms of economics, in terms of politics. It is a country that has difficult times. But there is one thing that still keeps the country very much united, and which is very much related to heritage. So people do identify themselves with their tangible, intangible heritage. They do get very attached. They're very attached to the cities that they have preserved, and you see this magnificent panorama of Firenze, of Florence. So this is the international brand image of Italy today. So because of the measures that were taken at the time where there was no even like large public demand for this, but there was a stance taken by a number of intellectuals and in collaboration with the government that allowed the country to stand where it stands today. So that's, I feel it's a very relevant case for Asia. I wanted to share a little bit the example of Chanderi on which we worked at Intact, but maybe I'll leave it for another time and just come to the conclusions.
If you want. Yeah, it's fine.
You want?
Yeah.
Should I? Okay. All right. Okay. Yes. Yes. So. Okay, thank you for the interest. So okay, I'll take just a few minutes to mention Chanderi. So this was to kind of take the transition of these different cases of what has been done in different countries and say that yes, there is potential to do something like this in India. We as Seher and Tak, we looked at the city of Chanderi at the request of the UNESCO office in New Delhi. So we took this request and we made a visit there mid last year. And this visit was quite revealing to me personally because I am based in Delhi for the last 6-7 years. That was the first city I've seen where there is still a kind of holistic experience of heritage. It's not single buildings here and there, but the city is still, yes. Like for example, if you look at the use of traditional built materials, it's still predominantly using brick, using stone. The pavement to a large extent is still kind of stone pavement. So these things matter because if you have a few heritage buildings here and there and then you just have a concrete CC pavement, that already breaks the whole urban fabric. So in Chanderi, it's a small city, so it's about 55,000 people right now, tier 3 city as we call it, which majorly focuses on sari weaving, traditional sari weaving with hand looms. There are about 40% of people involved in this industry. It's a city that is not that hardly affected by climate change, but yes, the annual rainfall is increasing, especially extreme rainfalls in the monsoon time. So there are extreme heats and flash floods that are taking place. The city features a number of outstanding heritage, you can say, outlets. I don't want to say monuments because yes, there are about actually there are about 11 protected monuments, half of them ASI and half of them state. So for such a small city, it's quite tremendous. But the value of these monuments is very much enhanced by vernacular architecture. At the moment, Chanderi has about 70% of vernacular architecture, which is still preserved from heritage times, different epochs, but all together. The blue-green network of Chanderi is highly developed. It used to be about 1,200 baulis. Now about 40 of them remain. And the natural drainage system was working quite well because, as you see on the map, there is a mountain from which basically water would naturally pour down from north and south directions, and then there would be just natural system in which water would just get evacuated from the city, which actually was partly destroyed by new constructions, but also by engineers who have not, where it is this, yes, so you can see this new engineering drainage systems that were put in place, which I think we're not looking much into topography because they're pretty dry. And yes, the engineers kind of told me unofficially that yes, the system has not taken into consideration natural conditions and therefore is not performing as it should. Okay. So yes, in fact, still use of local materials is predominant, and Intac has just recently done a project where it renovated one house, it built another house in a traditional manner, and a small public square. But people's aspirations is really concrete cement houses as of now. So because most of this vernacular architecture is not protected, I saw myself under my eyes like a 300-year-old building demolished, and that was a painful experience. So, so yes, this awareness, the kind of the value that the city holds, is not there overwhelmingly. Not only among people, but even among the municipality, because when we talked with them, they said yes, we very much want tourists, but they don't relate tourism potential to the actual cultural assets that they have, and it's a bit of a locked city because the road to reach it is quite bad. It's about 1 hour drive on pretty much no road at all. So that is an issue. But at the same time, when we did the assessment of the city, we have started developing an action plan that soon we will share with the authorities. That actually says that a number of these assets can transform the city and what we call make it unique heritage and green model city with a vibrant economy and quality of life. A number of issues are there. For example, the weavers don't have access to the end client. So as of now, they receive about 25-30% of the actual price of the sarees that they're weaving. So one way would be to bring more visitors that would also interact with these people directly. But as of now, the city is not ready to receive such visitors. There are only about 2 hotels. One is in Chanderi and one is completely outside. So now, in fact, the authorities have realized this lack of accommodation. So what they started doing, they started building big hotels, which is not at all what the city needs. It's a small-scale city. So here, homestays would have been perfect for people to really get fully immersed into the atmosphere of the city and spend time with the locals. As of now, that is not taking place, but that's what we want to suggest. In addition, the different baulis. So first of all, the city is still quite low on the water supply. I think maybe about 20 people are covered by pipes. That too often these are kind of outside pipes, not in each house. You have to go to the point and collect water. And the groundwater is depleting because about 80% of people are just using groundwater. So these baulis, in addition to replenishing groundwater, could also have a very interesting recreation purposes. In fact, we saw some children playing in some of this water where solid waste is lying as well. So one could, just make this experience a bit more comfortable. Another interesting idea that we had was, if you look at the master plan on the left lower corner, the orange zone is now the agricultural land. So the city plans by 2030 or 35, I don't remember exactly, to double its population. I mean, I know for India it's very small numbers. From 35,000, they're going to be 65. But then already they believe that now they should remove this agricultural land and build concrete over it. We feel that there is no need to do it as of now, but actually just in front of this agricultural land, there is a government kind of compound area, which is practically empty. The houses are very kind of separated from each other. The area is not taken care of. It's very dry. The trees are dying there. So what we want to suggest again here is to rather use this area, and ideally to create a kind of architectural style that would not copy the vernacular architecture, but that would get inspired from it. Because then the city would get the advantage of providing a holistic, immersive experience, what we discussed with Singapore. Like, instead of having just concrete boxes that now dominate the whole India from south to north and east to west, instead of that, having something that has a unique element which would both be comfortable for citizens to live in, but which would also enhance on the quality. Because again, Singapore, it's not only for heritage people go for, but also for the amazing, actually, I have to say, contemporary architecture. So all together things combine. And that's something that we feel with Chanderi, which is still a relatively small city, yet not spoiled enough, spoiled by sporadic constructions. There is a huge potential to kind of intervene and do. I mean, these are some of the measures. And of course, yes, so there are a number of lakes. So it's called the City of Seven Lakes. So some of them now are drying out. On some of them there was an idea of constructing on them, but we believe that actually these ones could be revived. And what one of the local stakeholders had explained to us is that the very south lake, it has hills underneath it. So what happens in dry, kind of hot times, if the air flies through the lake and then it hits against the hills and it goes back to the city, then it provides certain cooling. So the point I want to make here is that when we look at heritage as Seher and Tak, and I mean overall, the kind of winning position is to look at it holistically. It's not only we are going to deal with the bowlers, but what is the water system and how we can enhance the quality of life of people so that access to heritage and the role of heritage gets enhanced, and other assets, such as natural assets and intangible heritage assets, they also get enhanced in contact with each other. So that was the whole idea of look at Chanderi. We are in process of working on this now, and just few conclusions. Basically one conclusion per case. So in Siem Reap, I want to highlight that heritage has the capacity to address today's urban development sustainability priorities, but it needs to be unlocked. Usually these are institutional and policy problems. They are not problems with heritage as such. With the case of Singapore, I want to highlight the importance of a holistic and systematic approach. So not only focusing on heritage, not only focusing on natural assets, but really seeing how things complement each other. With the example of Hanoi, I want to underline that of course, we don't necessarily need to think big immediately. Imagine, of course, now in India we can't completely go and reform institutions. And in the debate we can talk about it. I mean, I omitted certain things, but yes, I mean, there are a number of challenges we face in here. But a small step, for example, pedestrianizing an area, it doesn't cost you anything, and you can see how people connect, you can see the response, it can be a temporary measure. So we need to find that entry point in different Indian cities. What can we start with, which is affordable, which is not only financially, but institutionally as well? Where can we get consensus to start with something? The case of Italy, so investing into heritage does pay off. That's what Asian cities need to understand. Most of them, Singapore had this awareness in the 80s. I've recently been to Kuala Lumpur and to Manila, and first of all, I can't even make a difference because now the concrete jungles are the same all over, and it's extremely oppressive. It creates a like heat island effect that is unbearable. Floods are commonplace scenario. No character in terms of what is the uniqueness of that place. This is where in Asia we are heading pretty much. In India and South Asia, maybe they're not skylines, but they're concrete boxes, which are not much more aesthetically attractive, but kind of low rise maybe at the moment. So we need to get out of this. And these examples, such as Singapore or Italy, they show us that investing does pay off because then you build your kind of competitive, comparative advantage by investing into unique natural heritage assets. So that's what we want to do with Chanderi. Thank you so much for being patient and for being interested, and I look forward to your questions.